Help me in welcoming Holly, Brophy-Herb.
Well, thank you. It's lovely to be here, and thank you for hanging with me. I know it's late in the afternoon, and it's easy to get sleepy, so I'm going to try to share with you what I think is some really interesting information about some of the work that we're doing, and I'm going to give you a snapshot of several different studies rather than going in depth in any one particular study, but feel free to email me, or we can chat afterwards if you'd like any other specific information about some of the studies. But our website is here. We have a whole team of folks, wonderful graduate students, one of whom, Neda Sinahi, one of my wonderful doctoral students, is here. We have a whole team of colleagues across departments as well. So I won't list everyone now. It's an extensive list, but just know that it's we're really a very collaborative team. So I want to talk today about some of the studies that intersect in these three areas. So as Julie mentioned, we've been doing a lot of work around parental emotion socialization practices, so deliberate things that parents do to teach very young children about emotions, what emotions are valued, how do you display emotions, what emotions do you mask, what's the function of emotion within our family, but also the unintentional ways that parents teach that through the modeling that they're doing or the ways that they respond to children's expressions of negative emotions, for example. Then I'll tell you about a couple of studies that focus on parental psychosocial functioning and family functioning kinds of things, and how those are related to children's outcomes, and in particular children's characteristics that provide some buffering effects even in the context of family stress. And then finally ending up with an example of an intervention study that we're carrying out now that's focused on building children's self-regulation capacities as a way to address obesity risk. So hopefully we'll have time to touch on all of those. I did want to mention just a number of conceptual models that have guided our thinking and continue to do so. Certainly, there are a number of models of emotion socialization that take the family context in mind. Eisenberg's fabulous model from some time ago, Morris's model, Thompson and Meyer, as well as family systems theory. We're doing a lot of dyadic work now where we're really thinking about the interdependence of maternal and paternal behaviors on each other's behaviors as well as their own parenting behaviors. That's been really interesting to us. Our work is also really informed by issues of the study of mind-mindedness, so parents' capacities to think about their own internal states and motivations for their behaviors and desires in themselves, but also to really try to understand those in their infants and toddlers, and then to use that information to guide how they respond to their infants and toddlers' behaviors. A lot of work on cultural context. We're really interested in how emotion socialization behaviors differ across cultures and how those behaviors mean different things and serve different functions in different cultures. And there's a number of really wonderful researchers that are carrying out work in this area. Amy Halberstadt had a really lovely qualitative monologue that came out a year or two ago on emotion socialization across cultures. And I really love Heidi Keller's work. She's an anthropologist who has a lovely piece on self-regulation from an evolutionary and a cultural and societal perspective as well. Biopsychosocial models, Paul Hastings has this is, I think, a really interesting study where he's looked at the interplay of parasympathetic regulation in interaction with emotion socialization practices and found that for preschoolers with fewer regulatory capacities, again from this parasympathetic system, benefited the most from emotion socialization strategies in terms of social adjustment in preschool. Which is closely related to emerging models of differential susceptibility and the ways in which we can think about the interaction of parenting behaviors and genetic bases as well. So a lot to really guide our work and keep things really exciting. To start off with, we're going to talk about emotion socialization practices as they're related to children's competencies. And these are two examples of studies that I'm going to talk briefly about. One is some work that we did in trying to model an emotion-related parenting construct. So rather than any one particular parenting behavior, we're really interested in a constellation of parenting behaviors that may work together in support of children's skills. And then we also have a pilot study that we're wrapping up right now, and one of the things we're looking at is fathers and toddlers' mental state language, with the use of mental state language as being one example of an emotion socialization behavior. So just briefly, emotion socialization is really a pretty extensive literature. It includes things like the parent's emotional supportiveness of the child, expressivity, both in the home and a parent to a child during an interaction, support of children's self-regulatory attempts, the use of mental state talk, emotion coaching beliefs as well as behaviors. So the idea is that emotions have some value and they have a function, and that we should encourage the expression of emotion rather than dismissing that or engaging in a disapproving attitude, which are sort of two more negative dimensions of emotion coaching. And that there has been work to support that these kinds of behaviors form a cohesive construct of emotion socialization. This is really important to study because we know that emotions are so rooted in cultural context, but yet if you look at preschool curricula, if you look at elementary school curricula, if you look at anti-bullying curricula, they're really all based on Euro-American models of emotion and models of emotion socialization. So that's one of the things, and I'll talk just briefly about one of the ways that we're looking at that. But the other thing that's really been understudied is whether or not these emotion-related behaviors function across socioeconomic context. So that's the next study I'm going to talk about. But in general, the literature that we have available suggests that emotion socialization practices are related to children's self-regulatory skills, although the bulk of the research has been focused on the relationship between emotion socialization and things like emotion knowledge and emotion understanding. We think that emotion socialization impacts self-regulatory skills by doing things like providing shared control in play, allowing children opportunities to practice emerging self-regulation skills. Just really important in toddlerhood, because toddlerhood is a period of really relatively rich development and explosion of self-regulatory skills towards the end of toddlerhood. So it's a really good time to kind of capitalize on what's happening and to support that. We think it provides emotionally supportive contexts that allow children to gradually assume self-regulatory control in mid to late toddlerhood and then to build from there. And then in general, emotional expressivity in the home provides an ongoing model of regulatory behaviors and expectations. And those expectations and the degree of modeling and the quality of modeling are, of course, going to differ, but that is a present influence in the child's life. So in our study, and this was a low-income sample, this was primarily Caucasian parents. This is the part where we tried to figure out whether or not these emotion-related behaviors function in the same way in a low-income sample that they do in an upper and a middle-income sample, which is really where the bulk of the work has been done. And there's kind of mixed evidence, right? There's some studies that have shown that the quality of parenting in lower income homes is not as positive, yet in our own work we found wonderful examples of very sophisticated, very positive forms of parenting. There's been some literature that's talked about the differences in work context, and that if you're someone from an upper middle income home and your work context is going to be one in which you can engage in conversation about emotion and you can express your desires and your thoughts and your feelings, but if you're working in a minimum wage job, it's very unlikely that your boss is going to sit there and want to discuss feelings and hopes and aspirations with you. So we wanted to explore that, and this was actually part of a larger curriculum development and evaluation grant that was funded by ACF. But we had a chance to look at some of these emotion socialization behaviors. So these are the things that we looked at. We looked at parental warmth. We looked at supportiveness, emotional responsivity to children during interactions. We looked at the parents' use of mental state language. We looked at mealtime socialization, so the extent to which parents really viewed mealtime as a time to kind of emotionally connect with their children. We looked at self-expressivity in the home and looked to see how those kind of clustered together. And in fact, they did. They did hold together. And they were related to home visitors or observers' ratings of toddlers' coping. So this would be coping with environmental stimuli. And also, it was related to toddlers' delay of gratification in a standard lab task. And the effect sizes are fairly decent. So our conclusion from this was that at least in this low-income context, we're seeing some examples of very sophisticated forms of parenting that are clustering together to provide a very emotionally supportive atmosphere for toddlers, and that those are in fact related to some of the outcomes that we were hoping for. Which is essentially what I have here. So I think part of the value of this is for one thing, it sends the message, or it sort of corrects the myth, hopefully, that low-income parents aren't positive parents, that they aren't good parents, because this type of parenting takes a lot of emotional energy and a lot of a lot of resilience in the face of a number of different kinds of stressors that are associated with poverty. So think that's an important message to get out there. But it also helps us to understand within group differences. So within any one group, whether it's a cultural group or a group in poverty or whatever it might be, that there are really rich differences to try to understand and to try to get a handle on. And incidentally, this is related to some other work that we did in which we tried to understand parenting profiles that had a little bit to do with psychosocial functioning and family functioning. So for example, we looked to see how characteristics like maternal sense of mastery, stress, parenting stress, conflict in the family, beliefs about emotions, a sense of self-efficacy, whether or not those kinds of characteristics sort of clumped together in different profiles. And when we found that they did, right? So there was a highly optimal functioning group which sort of had high scores on all the things that you would think are positive, like positive expressiveness in the family, and they were low on things like low conflict. So they had high mastery, high impulse control, low conflict. And then we had a more distressed group, and those were the families that had the most negative score. So they had high family conflict, high perceived stress, a low sense of mastery, high sense of impulsiveness, more negative emotion beliefs. But then there were these two middle groups, one of which was we called the highly expressive family, because these were families that scored pretty high on family conflict, but they also scored pretty high on positive expressivity. So they were sort of just emotionally expressive all around. And then there was a group that was more of a controlled group. So these are the families that were less expressive. They were just sort of neutral all the way around. Well, the thing is, there weren't really very many differences in the sort of highly functional group, in the expressive group, and in the controlled group. Really, we only saw more negative differences in terms of ratings of children's behaviors in the group that had the lowest scores on the positive things and the highest scores on the negative things. Which really kind of goes back to this idea of equifinity, right? That there's multiple pathways to positive outcomes. And so we saw all this variation in family behavior, but there really weren't a lot of differences in how that was relating to child outcomes. So again, it's just the story of how much there is to try to parcel out in families in terms of what's happening in support of children's social and emotional development. So that led us to a pilot study that we're doing right now, and one of the things that we're looking at is fathers and toddlers' mental state language. And I'll talk about mental state language in a second, but there's actually a pretty robust literature that talks about mental state language as being related to young children's competencies. Again, most of this is around emotion knowledge kind of thing, but there are some studies that suggest it's related to self-regulatory capacity as well. But research on fathers' use of mental state language is really just beginning to emerge, and so we were really excited about the opportunity to explore that a little bit in response to toddlers' use of mental state language. So we were also really interested in how family characteristics, particularly around the relationship between the mother and the father, and these were all married couples, might have to do with fathers and toddlers' use of mental state language as well. So pretty small sample, just about 64 dads, and again, this particular sample is a Caucasian sample. When we talk about mental state language, we're drawing on the work of a number of other researchers who've designed or who've identified these kinds of categories. So emotion words, happy, angry, sad, cognitive state words, think, know, believe, modulations of assertion, words like perhaps, maybe, could be, might, desire words that have to do with the child's goals or the child's preferences. And we had dads share with their toddlers, and these were 24 to 36-month-old toddlers, this book called Fly Little Bird. And in the book, there's a story of a little girl who loses her pet bird, and so she finds the bird and takes the bird home, and they're having a lovely time together. They're playing and doing art and building forts in the living room, and then the bird flies away and gets lost. And so the little girl goes on a hunt. So it's a wordless book, but there are a number of illustrations in the book, each of which sort of depict these different levels of emotions. And we were interested in the extent to which dads picked up on those emotional cues and talked about them during this book sharing task. So we found some sort of interesting things about the variations and how dads were talking about that. Now, some dads were just narrating the book. Oh, she found the bird, she put the bird in the basket, oh, she's taking the bird home. But there were other dads who were using a lot of mental state language in various different ways. So we had some dads who were talking about mental state language in terms of trying to put an emotion in context for a child. like, she's sad because the bird flew away, and then they were so happy that the bird grew up and the bird learned how to fly, and, one dad was talking about, and, she kept a picture of the bird over the bed so she could always remember him. That's pretty advanced. That's pretty cool stuff for a 24 to 36-month-old, for a dad to, be modeling that sort of thinking. And then there were dads who used mental state language with qualities of mentalization, so qualities of sort of modeling how I, as another person, might get inside the head of somebody else. So we had dads kind of narrating what they thought the characters in the book were thinking. And so she, the little girl in the story, is wondering to herself, hey, this is the bush where we found Petey the bird in the first place, so maybe he's in there, maybe we should look there, or trying to interpret the bird's intentions. The bird's looking out the window, and he's thinking, maybe I should fly out that window, maybe I should go see what's out there. This is really rich language. This is really cool stuff. And then there were some dads that were using mental state language to try to link the content in the book with the child's experiences. Like, you like to draw just like the bird. You both like to draw. So we're still sorting through the data in terms of these different levels of mental state language. But what I'm going to show you now is what are some of the characteristics that are related to dad's overall mental state language. So we focused on aspects of the family climate, which include the mother's report and the father's report of conflict in the co-parenting relationship, mother report and father report of couple conflict, and they were interviewed separately. Their reports of negative expressivity in the home and their emotion beliefs. So their emotion coaching beliefs and their emotion dismissing beliefs. So beliefs that we want to encourage emotion expression and beliefs that we should just sort of rush through children's expressions of negative emotions. And in the second model I'll show you, we looked at what might be related to toddlers' use of mental state language. So what we found in terms of what's related to dad's use of mental state language is really the mother's report of destructive conflict. And you heard Dr. Cummings this morning talking about examples of destructive conflict. And so those would be things like verbal aggression, stonewalling, avoidance, involving the child in the conflict. But the interesting thing was dad's perceptions of conflict didn't relate to dad's use of mental state language. Mother's report of her perception of the dad using verbal aggression didn't relate to dad's mental state conflict. It was only mother's report of what she herself did in terms of conflict, which again starts to speak a little bit to this intersection I was talking about. The interdependence of what mom's doing impacts what dad's doing, and vice versa, although more often than not we see effects of mom's behavior to dad rather than vice versa. And then father's emotion dismissing beliefs were negatively related to the amount of mental state language he was using. Okay, so father's beliefs, emotions beliefs weren't necessarily related to toddlers' use of mental state language. Now, how often dad used mental state language in the course of their interaction was related to toddlers' mental state language. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. But then there was this sort of interesting moderation, this interesting interaction effect. Again, small sample, it's exploratory. But the model fits pretty good. Where we have toddlers were using more mental state language during the course of that book sharing task when their mothers were reporting high supportiveness of toddlers' expressions of negative emotions. So these were the moms who encouraged their toddlers to express emotions. They helped them work through the problem. They would talk about emotions and what the child was upset about during, if the child wasn't able to have a cookie when he wanted the cookie or whatever it might be. So high maternal use of mental state language and dad's low unsupportiveness. So not dad's supportiveness, but just dad's not being unsupportive of toddlers' expressions of emotion. So we expected that the most robust model would be sort of a double dose when dad is high in emotional supportiveness of the toddler's negative emotions and when mom is high in toddlers' expressions of negative emotions, but that wasn't the case. There wasn't a positive by positive interaction. It was just this context of mom being highly supportive of expressions of negative emotions and dad's just not being not supportive, which is kind of interesting. So at least in this model, it may be that at least early on, or at least in this period of toddlerhood, that moms seem to be carrying a little more weight in terms of what might be internalizing for toddlers. And that may have to do with who's the primary caregiver. So in this study, the moms were primarily the caregivers, and that may be part of that relationship. Interesting. So in general, for dads, it tended to be sort of things that were happening in the couple relationship, but for the toddler, it was things more proximal to the toddler that was related to the toddler's use of mental state language, and that was primarily how the parents reported responding to the child's emotions. I mentioned that we were doing some cross-cultural work on mental state language, and I just wanted to mention that really quickly. So we're using a secondary data set, and we're coding mothers' and children's use of mental state language during conflict resolution tasks. So these children were a little older at this point. They were 9 years old. And we had, it's a national sample from the Early Head Start Research and Evaluation Studies. It's a pretty large sample. And mothers and their 9-year-old children had to choose 3 things that they argue most about. And they were things like not doing homework, or arguing with peers, not doing chores, that kind of thing. And then they had 8 minutes to discuss how they were going to solve those problems. And that was videotaped. And then we transcribed those, and we've been coding the mother's use of mental state language and the child's use of mental state language, and looking at how the frequencies of mental state language and then the relations from mental state outcomes to children's social outcomes in school and academic outcomes in school might be the same or different across African American, Latino American, and Caucasian Euro-American families. And one of the things that we're finding, and this is still ongoing, so it's by no means definite, but one of the things that we're finding is that mothers' use of mental state language for Euro-American children, so mothers' use of mental state language paired with sort of supportive responses if the child was expressing a thought or a feeling or a wish during that conflict resolution task. So if there was support of the child and the mom is using mental state language, those kinds of things were related to teachers' ratings of children's cooperative behaviors, but only for Euro-American children. For African American children, there tended to be no results or somewhat negative results. So for example, there was a trend toward teachers' greater ratings of hyperactivity for African American children in the context of higher mental state language. And for Latino American children, they were sort of in the middle. So they didn't usually differ from Euro-American children in terms of outcomes, and they really didn't differ from African American children in terms of outcomes. So, again, I think this is suggesting the different roles that mental state language may play in different cultures and the different meanings of emotions and the different functions of emotions. And so it's very tedious work, it's very exciting, but it's taking a very long period of time. But we are moving through that, and I think that's going to be a really interesting set of results in terms of how this mental state language might work differently in different outcomes. I mentioned our interest in emotion socialization behaviors, and so how mental state language, how emotional supportiveness, how that can be used to help toddlers regulate emotions. And so I wanted to show you 2 video clips from our current pilot study that I was mentioning. And we're working on coding these for what toddlers do and then what dads do when they're trying to co-regulate together. So in the clips I'm going to show you, we used a lockbox task, and I'm not going to show you the whole task. I'm just going to sort of fast forward to certain parts. But essentially, we had the dad and the toddler choose a toy to play with. They got to play with it for a few minutes, and then we asked dad to take the toy from the child and put it in a locked plexiglass box that the child could see but couldn't get into, although you'll see some of them did. And then we told the dad not to explain why he was taking the toy other than just to take it and say, it's time to put the toy away. Then we gave dad some busy work. So dad was uninvolved and unavailable to the child for the first minute of the wait period. And then for the second minute, dad could interact as he normally would. So we're fast forwarding to the part where the toy gets locked up in the box. So then dad can play a few minutes, but dad continues to sit in the chair and doesn't engage a great deal. And then this is another toddler who has a sort of a different approach. So he continues to wait, he points at the toy, kind of rests his head against the toy. When the experimenter comes back in and they unlock the box, the dad actually uses some mental state language. Are you sad because the toy's in the box? What can we do while we're waiting? And at one point, and if there were time I would show you the whole thing, but at one point the toddler and the dad are next to each other and they're mirroring each other's body movements. They're in the exact same position. And you'll notice this toddler used the dad at the very beginning, was standing near the dad, and he put his, like, sat on his hands. I mean, he was using quite a few different regulatory strategies. And then when the dad is able to engage, he uses a lot of language, and he pats the toddler, so he uses touch to kind of help that toddler self-regulate as well, which is different from the first dad, who kind of stayed unengaged. And of course, his child in the first video, it was really, really challenging to try to wait for that toy. As you saw, he needed to get into the box each time. So again, we're really seeing a wide range of strategies that dads are using during expressions of negative emotions, and different ways that toddlers are trying to cope with those negative emotions. Okay, so moving on to kind of give you a snapshot of some of the things around parental psychosocial functioning as they're related to competencies. So, as you know, certainly the quality of the parents' mental functioning in terms of mental health has great impacts on the development of children's regulatory skills. But children's regulatory skills also play a protective role in buffering against the effects of family stress and other kinds of stressors in the environment. So higher self-regulatory skills sort of across the literature promote adaptive functionings in multiple developmental domains and tends to moderate the effects of parental and maternal psychopathology and harsh parenting, which is what our next model is about. So this was, again, using the Early Head Start longitudinal data set, so a pretty large sample, about 2,900 kids. And we were interested in the extent to which early self-regulation skills might have some protective benefits over the long term. And one of the things that we were looking at is maternal substance use, so not abuse. This is use of alcohol, drugs, and smoking that don't reach abusive clinical levels. But there's actually a growing body of literature that talks about the importance of looking at frequent use of drugs and alcohol, for example, that don't necessarily reach clinical levels of concern. So we looked at that. We looked at maternal substance abuse when children were 9 years old and their behavioral outcomes, both parent-rated and teacher-rated when they were 9 years old. But we looked at their early self-regulation skills when they were about 3 in terms of potential protective benefits. And the hypothesis was that these self-regulatory skills early on would promote the child's acquisition of strategies and skills that would help that child tolerate stressors over time, make better use of learning environments, and those kinds of things to, in a sense, have a different developmental trajectory than a child with very low kinds of self-regulation skills. So we thought the story of the relationship between maternal substance use and children's outcomes would likely be told through its impact, for example, on family conflict or harsh discipline. There's a lot of literature that says that the effects of substance use are typically mediated. That relationship is explained through the effects of conflict, which then have outcomes, which then impact child outcomes, and the same for harsh parenting. So we tested those mediation models, whether or not conflict mediated the relationship between substance use and children's outcomes, and whether or not the same was the case for harsh parenting. And then we looked to see whether or not self-regulation moderated those relationships. And so we looked at whether or not self-regulation moderated the relationship here between family conflict and children's outcomes, whether or not it moderated the relationship between harsh discipline and children's outcomes, and whether or not it moderated this direct relationship between substance use and children's outcomes. And what we found is that, so this first column is family conflict. And what we found is that early self-regulation did moderate directly, though, not through conflict. Oops. So early self-regulation moderated this relationship between substance use and children's outcomes. It did not moderate family conflict. Which was a little surprising to us. So there is something about this direct relationship, and that might be through modeling of dysregulatory kind of behaviors. It might be either through, or it might be through a complete withdrawal of maternal behavior. So, right, sometimes substance abuse might come across in very intrusive kinds of behaviors, but it also might be a more neglectful total withdrawal from the child. Now, these effects are pretty small, so there are other things in this model that are not not yet told, and we're trying to sort out what some of those might be. It might have to do with routines in the home and whether or not those routines are chaotic or not, those kinds of things. But here's the interesting thing. So of course, concurrent self-regulatory skills are related to behavioral outcomes. And this effect of early self-regulation is really small. This is when they were 3 years old, and they're 9 years old now. So the fact that we're seeing some residual effects from early self-regulation skills on outcomes when they're 9 years old, controlling for concurrent self-regulation, is pretty remarkable, especially since these parents, and there were no program effects, so there weren't differences for parents who were enrolled in Early Head Start versus parents who were enrolled in, or versus parents who were just in whatever services in the community were available. So those programs weren't necessarily targeting the development of self-regulation per se. Imagine if they had been targeting the development of self-regulation per se. There might be stronger effects here. So this is really interesting to us that we're still seeing something about early self-regulation years later, even taking into account things like current demographic risk and substance use and current self-regulation skills. Now, if we look at the model, oh, and here's the graph of that. So externalizing behaviors here. So externalizing behaviors were highest in the case of low self-regulation and high maternal conflict. And so the dotted line are the kids with higher self-regulation skills when they were 3 in the context of also having high maternal substance use. When we look at the story for hyperactivity, it's a much weaker model. And there is really not much in terms of any kind of moderation effects that are very strong. So there is still a small effect for self-regulation. Oh, sorry, that's conflict. Oop, never mind. Oh, yeah, for the hyperactivity model, it really didn't hold together. There was a very small effect for self-regulation skills. So that part held, but there was really no moderated or mediated relationship for the path from harsh parenting to children's outcomes. So still this very small direct effect, but here it is graphed out. So these are the children, so these are teachers' ratings of hyperactivity when children were 9. These are children with higher self-regulation skills when they were 3 who also had high family conflict. And then these are the children with lower self-regulation skills in the context of high family conflict and hyperactivity. So nothing with harsh parenting, but again, a little bit with family conflict here. So again, this sort of speaks to whether or not building early self-regulation skills early on can have these long-term effects, and this would suggest that those are good entry points for intervention. The other thing I wanted to mention in terms of early psychosocial functioning on later outcomes is a study that Tiffany Martocchio, who's one of my former doctoral students, is leading. And this is a really interesting study. This is also from the National Early Head Start Research and Evaluation Study, where we're looking at early maternal depression at when babies were 14 months old, harsh parenting from 14 to 36 months old, and then children's internal representations of families when they were about 5 years old, so as they were about ready to enter kindergarten. Harsh parenting was defined as discipline severity as well as observed maternal negative regard of a child during interactions. And internal representations were measured via the MacArthur story stem narratives. So there were 7 different story stems that were given to children. All of the themes of the story stem had something to do with a parental figure in terms of loss or expressions of negative emotions or separation from the parent or conflict. So, for example, one of the stories is about lost keys. And so the experimenter has a set of dolls, figurines that are kind of tailored toward the composition of the child's own family. And the experimenter will say, like, if these are the 2 dolls, we'll act out the first part of the story. Dad came in and said, "Mom, you lost my keys." And Mom said, "I did not." And then the experimenter says, "Show me and tell me what happens next." And the child acts out. When they're 5 years old, they sort of act out what happens next in the story. So from those, from their completions of the narratives and their articulations, we coded what we termed dysregulated internal representations, which included dysregulated aggression in their narratives. So these would be things like more explosive kinds of aggressive acts, like the 2 dolls beginning to physically fight or interact with each other, or verbally the child might say something like, "and then she killed him," or "then she threw him against the wall." I mean, more intensive kinds of aggressive descriptions. Negative affect, which include themes of sadness or anger or distress, either depicted in facial expressions or verbally. And then also children's withdrawals from emotional themes. So their avoidance of whatever the relational conflict that was present in the story stem would be. Just in terms of gender differences in story stems, girls had significantly higher levels of sadness and negative affect in their narrative responses. Boys had significantly higher levels of avoidant withdrawal and dysregulated aggressions in their narrative responses, which is somewhat consistent with how girls and boys are socialized to deal with emotions, right? Girls tend to be socialized more around negative affect and sadness, where boys are punished for that. And the dysregulated aggression often also intersects with how boys express frustrations in terms of externalizing behaviors. So what we found in the model, and I'll kind of read over the results, but essentially the first set of findings is for boys, and the second set of findings is for girls. So this is maternal depression at 14 months. This is harsh parenting over time, so initially and then over time. And then these are children's, the latent construct for children's dysregulated internal representation. So avoidant withdrawal, dysregulated aggression, and negative affect. And what we see are different paths for boys and girls. So for boys, there was a direct relationship between early maternal depression and boys' internal representations when they were 5 years old. For girls, that path was mediated through the growth of harsh parenting over time. So maternal depression fed into harsh parenting, which then fed into girls' dysregulated, internalized representations of families. So that's kind of interesting, and it might mean a couple of different things. So there is some literature to suggest that girls tend to be more socialized to the nuances of affective communication or underlying emotional themes in parent-child interactions, which might explain why girls are more impacted by elements of harsh parenting and their experiences of interacting with the parent during harsh parenting episodes. The literature on the relationship between maternal depression and boys' outcomes is somewhat mixed. But there's some evidence to suggest that boys are more directly impacted by maternal depression in terms of dysregulatory behaviors on the part of the mother. But again, it really points to the importance of trying to identify these individual differences and individual paths from the same maternal behavior, but really operating in different ways in terms of children's outcomes. Oh, which is what I just said. And then the last thing I wanted to very briefly mention, just in terms of a brief snapshot, is an intervention that we're doing called the Growing Healthy Study. So this is a bit of a leap of topics, because this is really focused on obesity prevention and Head Start. So eventually we'll have about 600 children. We're in the final year of data collection now. We'll have about 600 children across a number of Head Start classrooms in Michigan. You can see that, and so this is from the first couple of years of data. It's a diverse sample in terms of not as many Hispanic and Latino families, but about a third of the sample is African American, the rest Caucasian. But you can see a great percentage of mothers are obese, and actually a fairly large percentage of children at age 3 to 5 are obese or overweight as well. 63% of families with marginal to very low food security, so definitely an at-risk population. Essentially what we're exploring is whether or not, so this is a sort of healthy eating, nutrition only, it's the Parents of Preschool series. It's really focused on healthy eating, portion sizes, paying attention to children's cues of satiation, those kinds of things. Preparing healthy meals, increasing the variety and frequency of intake of fruits and vegetables, reducing the intake of sugar-sweetened beverages, for example. So whether or not that's related to these obesity-related health behaviors. But then the sort of Cadillac hypothesis is that if we include that nutrition, education, healthy eating behavior also with an intervention that's aimed at increasing children's delay of gratification skills, that we might have more robust effects in terms of impacting obesity-related health behaviors, which we then think over time, so we track them over the course of a year, will relate to better BMI scores and better adiposity indices in general. So the Parents of Preschool series has a classroom component, and it has a parent component. So in the classroom component, there are 6 lessons that are jointly administered by the Head Start teacher and by an extension educator. So the Head Start teacher does a lesson one week, and that's followed up by a cooking, tasting, demonstration, and sort of follow-up of content information the following week in the classroom. And at the same time, parents are getting a home-based, or a group-based parenting education curriculum as well, focused on the same content, increasing fruit and variety, frequency of fruit and vegetable intake, reducing sugar, sweetened beverages. They also learn healthy recipes, and they get to taste them. And then we're using IYS, the Incredible Years series, Carolyn Webster Stratton's intervention, which has been used with Head Start populations, and that has a classroom component as well as a parent component as well. So we see the children, we do home visits at the beginning of the year and do many, many assessments at the Head Start program, and then again at the end of the year, so pre-post. We get a variety of measures of regulatory capacity, direct assessments, as well as teacher report and parent report. A lot of information on emotional eating kinds of behaviors, eating behaviors in the home, maternal psychosocial functioning. We're also getting information, collecting data on the quality of the emotional climate of the preschool classroom, because we think that might also have a part to play in the development of children's self-regulatory skills. So, end of this year, we'll start to begin to put our data together. But our hypothesis is that this model, through child self-regulation, will have a more robust effect on children's adiposity indices over time. So, in short, this is a very quick, less than an hour snapshot of the role of emotional socialization, parental psychosocial and family functioning, as potential entry points for understanding how early prevention and intervention efforts can help to support very positive outcomes for children and families, which is the goal of why we're all doing what we're doing, of course. So, thank you.
Thanks, Holly. So I had a question about your substance use
Sure.
data. It was interesting to see how self-regulation moderated the links.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about why do you think some of those kids some of them had better regulatory skills than others? Maybe was it related to some other factors, you think?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there's some data from the early evaluation of early Head Start that self-regulatory capacities were impacted by program involvement, especially for some populations. But there was nothing in the early Head Start, that early part of early Head Start when it was first being evaluated. The program was really working through impacts on parenting, and then parenting support of children's self-regulatory skills, among other things. But there weren't program effects in this particular model in terms of regulatory skills or outcomes. But I think that might be a part of it. But the other, I think. I think there are differences in temperament as well. Now, we don't really have a great measure of that in this particular data set, but I think that might be a part of it. I think the quality of the early parenting is a part of that. I think the fit between the parent and the child in terms of how they were able to co-regulate their interactions together is also a part of the development of these regulatory skills that we see at age 3, which is pretty early on.
Right, okay, thank you.
I have a question.
Sure.
I think Bruce Perry would probably want, and others in the prior part of the symposium or the conference would want to emphasize the relationship between the parent and child or their primary caregivers as part of an intervention if you're going to try to improve health, right? Because the arguments that have been made in the last few days is that a lot of the health behavior issues are symptoms of an attachment, insecure relationship or environment or context. Sure. So I was wondering, I know probably the federal government is going to fund that because they want very specific, more individualistic focus on the child behavior instead of the context of everything, right? Do you have any reactions to that?
I think the overall context is, incredibly important. I mean, there's also, and we didn't include that in this model, and perhaps we should have, but there's also data in this data set about things like the mother's access to social supports. And so I think there are a number of contextual factors that are part of the overall global picture. So yes, and the quality of relationships, both in terms of the parent-child relationship as well as with other extended family members. And we have less data on that part of it, but the stability of the family system as a whole, I think, is quite important. So one of the things they found in this data set, for example, is that the quality of the neighborhood environment in terms of the crime rate and the amount of trash and vacant housing and those kinds of things was highly related to fathers' use of discipline. So dads who had the same level of psychosocial functioning were 3 times more likely to use harsh discipline if they were raising their children in environments that were characterized by higher crime rates and more trash and more vacant housing and those kinds of things. So, I think you raise a great point in terms of the quality of the relationship, not just between the parent and the child, but across the system as a whole, and even in the context of the neighborhood as being very, very important.
Thank you, Holly. I have 3 questions, although actually I'd be more interested in your saying more about what you were just talking about. But here they are, and then maybe you can say more about what you were just talking about. The first is, when you look at the videos and are coding those, maybe this doesn't happen, but I wondered if you might have amount and sophistication of mentalizing language in the parent that rated very high, except that it either was developmentally inappropriate or didn't fit the child's temperament or didn't fit the child's state in the moment. And then the second question is about constructs and to what extent you have on the one hand, explored these constructs in settings other than white middle class, which seems to be mostly what we're making assumptions about, and maybe even stepping away from the constructs to have people who are not white or middle class generate their own constructs, as Christy McWayne has done, and you probably know the paper she did with John Fantuzzo looking at the Baumrein constructs and how they didn't correlate at all to social emotional outcomes in African American children. Right. And then the third thing is with regard to some of the measurements. Sharon Ritchie at Frank Porter Graham has done some work looking at African American boys in classrooms and has found that the problem is not the African American boys, but what the non-African American people and contexts around them think and expect of them, so that she found that they would have higher ratings of things like hyperactivity by non-African American teachers. So when you have data that comes from teacher report, I wonder, do you look at race, and do you have ways of looking at what we're maybe missing there?
Yeah, those are 3 really great questions. So yes, a big part of mind-mindedness is whether or not mindedness-related comments are attuned to the child, so whether or not they're a good match or whether or not they're misattuned. And so that's a great point. We are just starting to look at those, to code those data. But yes, that will definitely be a part of the way that we're looking at the father's use of mind-mindedness during the co-regulation part of the task. So that's absolutely an important point. And we do have some data on the child's temperament, and then of course behavioral, we'll be able to see what the match is between the dad and the toddler. So I think that's an excellent point. And with regard to the constructs in cultural context, absolutely, I think that's why we're so fascinated by this mental state data in the early Head Start data set around the conflict resolution task, because we do expect that there would be different relationships because emotions just mean different things in different cultures. So I absolutely agree that we can't really jump to the point of testing constructs until we really understand what individual kinds of behaviors mean. So that's something that we're pursuing and looking for funding to do. I agree completely. And as I mentioned, it's a really pressing problem because curricula in schools are really focused around Euro-American models of socialization. So, I mean, I think it's a very pressing issue. And then the third item what was the third item? Oh, yes, absolutely. We do have information on teacher race, which will be an important thing to look at as we continue to develop this model a bit. Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. We don't have all of the data that we need to tell that story, but we have things that we could probably parcel out a bit more to get a richer picture of what's happening. Yeah.
I have one other question. Regarding self-regulation, there's data from other areas of science to show that birth experience matters. So if you separate the mom and baby at birth,
Right.
self-regulation is affected a year later.
Yeah.
Or we find in our data that mothers who continue to have high positive touch after 4 months have children at age 2 and 3 with better self-regulation.
Yeah.
And that's looking at John Borkowski's data set.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if there'd be a way for you to use the data set to look at those kinds of things. If you
There would
possibly
be.
could.
There are data on birth, sort of any birth trauma that occurred in the sort of early context of the birth, prematurity, or as well as birth complications. So I think that's a really great idea. Yeah, it's a publicly available data set too. If anyone is so moved to pursue that, I think that's a great point. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.